The Biden administration's plan for student loans aims to address the debt crisis by offering cancellation to various borrowers, something we've been covering regularly here at Cheddar. And so to dive deeper into this, I do want to bring in correspondent Diane King-Hall, joining me from studio at Cheddar headquarters. Diane, welcome. And what can you tell us?
Thank you so much for having me. All right, let's start with this. The Biden administration out with sweeping new plans to tackle the student loan debt crisis. Now, this is what's being dubbed as Plan B. Under this new proposal, it would offer cancellation to several types of borrowers. The most broad provision is seeking to essentially reset balances for people who have dealt with growing debt because of unpaid interest. The White House calls this, quote, runaway interest. Now, in its current structure, for the broadest measure, it would cancel up to $20,000 in interest for Americans who now owe more than what they first borrowed. They also have to be enrolled in an income-driven repayment plan. Oh, and by the way, that ceiling doesn't apply to individuals who make less than $120,000 a year or couples who earn less than $240,000. In other words, low and middle income borrowers enrolled in the SAVE plan or any other income-driven repayment plan would be eligible for the entire amount their balance has grown since entering repayment to be canceled under the administration's new plans. The Biden administration's plan would forgive interest balances built up to date for some 25 million borrowers, with about 23 million likely to have all their balance growth forgiven. Of course, keep in mind, this comes amid a push by the White House to find a way to make good on that promise to cancel heavy student loan debt. The Biden administration has been trying to come up with creative ways to do this since the Supreme Court blocked the original plans to give student debt relief to borrowers. Kristen?
Diane, great info there. And what are the biggest differentiators here in this plan from what we've seen previously?
Well, it was a bigger vision before. The plan was for a larger group of people, although this still does tackle millions. The original plan was to deliver $400 billion in debt relief to some 40 million borrowers. So this is less. It's fewer. Under this provision, it would be close to 30 million borrowers who could possibly benefit from these plans, and the amount envisioned to be canceled would also be less. So it is fewer than the original plan. The original plan was to deal with $400 billion in debt, and it was supposed to be under that HEROES Act. Right. And the Supreme Court at the time said no deal. This is an overreach in terms of the Biden administration's abilities to do this. So the Biden administration has been trying to find new creative ways to give student loan debt relief. We've seen this increasingly become more burdensome to borrowers, and the Biden administration has been trying to tackle that burden for borrowers. So this is a way to do this by addressing certain groups and trying to come up with kind of verticals, if you will, to offer debt relief to borrowers.
Well, Diane, I know earlier you mentioned that the broadest category of people this would apply to. Who else could benefit from this?
So there are about 5 groups that this would apply to. The first is that the group of people who's dealing with the so-called runaway interest. That's the people who, I guess this would be the version of underwater, if you will, where their interest outstrips the amount that they borrowed. Among the other groups on the list, you have people who have been in repayment for years, decades even, some at least 20 years. So 20 years or more, people who have been in repayment on undergraduate debt for that long. So they would qualify under these new plans. The third group would be people who took out loans to enroll in low value academic programs. That's how the White House is calling that. In other words, those are people, programs or schools that either lost their eligibility to participate in federal student aid, or in other words, they had left people with loans and burdensome debt for fields where they can't even earn enough to recoup the cost. In other words, people who have a diploma would earn the same amount as those individuals who incurred that debt. Next group would be those who qualify for pre-existing loan forgiveness programs but aren't enrolled in it now. So in other words, it's catching those people who have been left out of that group. So that's the fourth group. The last group is those people who are experiencing financial hardship. So So that is not quite as defined as those other groups, such as the largest group, which would those be people who are underwater in terms of the interest. Financial hardship, they're defining as things like medical debt, expensive child care, and those at risk of default. So those are the categories that would be caught up in this latest wave of trying to make good on the promise to deliver student loan forgiveness. Now, one thing I also want to mention, the timeline for this. Of course, these are new plans that have been revealed. That doesn't mean they go into effect right away. The next thing is they go to the Federal Register. That opens it up for public comment. The Biden administration is hoping this goes into effect by this fall.
Diane, great information here. And I know this plan, as you've discussed, obviously doesn't apply to everyone. But for those who are dealing with debt, what are some options for them, some ways to manage that debt?
So there's a few things to keep in mind when it comes to this. First, see if you are eligible. And besides the eligibility for this, you can also check for other programs, so such as working in certain fields, whether you're in a service job, in the medical industry. There's, of course, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness, PSLF. I always forget how to do that acronym. You can check to see if you're eligible for that program on studentaid.gov. So you can check that site for your eligibility for that. If you're in certain fields and you've been paying on your loans for 120 months, see if your field counts for that, or if you're working for an employer where forgiveness could apply. If you're not, you have to face the music. The one thing is, it's not going to go away if you stick your head in the sand. So just face it, open the emails, open the envelopes, and just look at it. You know, next, line it up in a spreadsheet or an app or something like that. Line up your debt. And then you can always take one of two methods in terms of paying down your debt: the avalanche or the snowball method. I know you all have talked about this before. A snowball method is when you're paying off your debt from the smallest amount to the highest debt. So 9 times out of 10 for either of those methods, your student loan is probably going to be the last thing that you end up tackling, because it's either a lower interest or just a larger amount in terms of your overall debt burden. Although I know you talked to the Wallet Hub editor earlier about how much credit card debt is ballooning. So the snowball method, you start with the smallest debt, you pay the minimum on every other debt, and you keep rolling up what you're paying to the next debt. And with the avalanche method, you're dealing with the highest interest rate debt. That's mathematically works out that you're paying it off a little bit quicker than the snowball method, but there's the psychological effect with the snowball method. So with the avalanche method, you tackle the highest interest rate debt first, your costliest debt. 9 times out of 10, that's going to be your credit card debt. If you're dealing with that, you tackle that first credit card bill, you go to the next credit card bill, you roll up that payment to the next. Again, you're paying the minimum on each of those. And of course, we can't just talk about defense. We have to talk about offense as well. Take on a side hustle. Earning more will certainly help you tackle all of these things faster, whether you're talking about student loan debt or the increasing burden of credit card debt.
Diane, great insight. Such a timely topic for us. Thank you for joining us in studio. That's Diane King Hall, correspondent.